समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Can you remember the last time a judgment came out of the UK, United Kingdom Supreme Court, that created global headlines and that also made an impact on global politics, particularly politics in global democracies, and there also more specifically in Western democracies, where polarization is usually liberal versus conservative. Many of the other democracies don't have that clear polarization. India, for example, does not have that clear polarization, which is liberal versus conservative, because both sides in many areas say the same thing. But in Western democracies, that is quite clear. And this judgment of UK Supreme Court has serious impact there. So what has the UK Supreme Court done? UK Supreme Court, in a case described as For Women Scotland, FWS, that's the name of the organization, For Women Scotland, versus the Scottish ministers. For Women Scotland had challenged the Scottish government, who had made rules thereby permitting trans women also to get into many organizations, bodies, committees, etc. in places reserved for women. So the point was that transgenders in this case who identified as women will be given place in these bodies as women. This was challenged by the organization called For Women Scotland, which stands for gender clarity, which believes that the gender is determined at birth. So everybody is a natal male or a natal female. That means male at birth, a female at birth, that doesn't change. Somebody is transgender, that is a very small percentage of people who are born like that, much less than 1% globally. For them, there's a different category. They're a category by themselves. They cannot choose to become women in particular. This is why FWS went with this challenge. They won this challenge. What does the UK Supreme Court say? All 5 judges unanimously. They say, and I quote just one odd line from it, which is relevant. It's an 88-page judgment. So compared to Indian Supreme Court, they still give much shorter judgments, 88 pages. They say, and I quote, the unanimous decision of this court is that the terms female and sex in Equality Act of 2010 refer to a biological female, biological woman, and biological sex. Now, there's been a long-standing debate, and that debate has intensified in the past 25 years with the rise of gender politics. And that debate is over a question of whether gender or sex is a biological construct or a social construct. Can you be born in one sex but feel like another sex and act like that, participate in social life, public life like that, and also go through gender transition surgery or gender transition hormonal treatment and become the other gender? Is that a possibility or not? The larger, harder liberal argument is yes, there should be gender fluidity, which means gender is not affixed to a human being at birth. The court, however, says that the gender is affixed to a human being at birth. Remember, that is something, it was one of the early executive orders passed by Donald Trump as well, where he said there are only 2 genders in United States of America, male and female. So once again, it left transgenders in a kind of uncertain area, but transgenders then become a category by themselves. They cannot choose to be one sex or the other. Usually, in a majority of cases, they would have chosen to be women, to be female. This Supreme Court, UK Supreme Court order, based on the side of what is seen as the conservative thought in the developed world, that Gender is assigned at birth. You cannot be born as one and then become something else. Now, what they say is this is an interpretation and clarity of the Equality Act of 2010, which reserved many rights for women. So the implication is that those rights under that act are only reserved for women and other people who might have been certified to be female. They cannot get those rights. Where does that question comes in? That question comes in from an earlier UK law. That's a 2004 law called Gender Recognition Act. This applies to those who might be born in one sex but may feel gender dysphoria. Dysphoria, dictionary definition, is a state of unease and generalized dissatisfaction with life. So X is born as male but has gender dysphoria, generalized dissatisfaction with life, which means with his gender, and wants to transition. So can transition in the course of time and can also identify themselves in a gender of their choice. In these cases, this 2004 law allowed the certification of the person in a different gender. These are called gender recognition certificates. So again, the argument was that, look, so-and-so may have been born male, right? Or so-and-so may have been transgender, but has now got this certificate because the person identifies themselves as female. So they've got this certificate saying they are female. That is GRC, Gender Recognition Certificate, under this 2004 law, which is the Gender Recognition Law. This is what the court has ruled on. The court says there is no ambiguity that you are born either male or female at birth. There can be no change. There can be no change after that. Of course, the court goes on to say that this should not affect the rights of transgenders. Their rights under the earlier law, the Gender Recognition Law, remain intact, except using that law, they cannot claim the rights of the women. And this case, as we told you, came up in Scotland because this organization for Women Scotland, FWS, they challenged the Scottish government because they decided on a more liberal interpretation of the term woman under a law called Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act of 2018. That would have brought in those who have had sexual gender transition or those who are transgenders also onto these boards in place of women. In the case of Great Britain, this would mean transgenders who come with GRCs or Gender Recognition Certificates. I may have been born whatever, but now I have a certificate saying I am female, so I get a woman's position. The court has said biological sex is assigned at birth, and interpreting sex as certified sex would create incoherence. Again, the court is speaking, UK High Court is speaking. So interpreting sex as certified sex would create incoherence and practical difficulty in applying the law consistently. This follows some of the steps taken by the Conservative government that preceded Keir Starmer's Labour government. For example, they put some restrictions and some conditions in schools on the age at which, the minimum age at which children could be given some education about sex, or at the age at which children could be made aware of the possibility of choosing their gender. Now, this has been welcomed by the political right all across the Western world, in the US, in Europe, everywhere. Because one of the things that becomes central to polarized politics in the Western world, Western democracies, but also it's something that Putin uses all the time. Now they are saying, God did not make just man or woman, you can assign gender by choice. You find this in many of Putin's speeches. That's been the song with him. That is something that Giorgia Meloni has been saying. If you see her campaign speeches, she said this all the time. It is something that Viktor Orban says. It's something that the French hard right says. It's also something that the German hard right has been saying, that this is liberalism gone too far. And liberalism gone too far means now you are not even willing to accept God's word. That's how politics works. God's word on whether somebody is male or female. You think you've become so arrogant that you can change somebody's gender just because you have some surgery or you have the hormones, and people make these choices as they go along, that they say as an act against God or an act against nature. So what we are going to do this time with this Karta Clutter, occasionally I will add a short opinion segment to Karta Clutter. So today be prepared, not just now, but as we go ahead, at some point, I will give you about a 2 or 3 minute segment of opinion on this very interesting and important new turn in gender politics across the world. We need to understand how we've reached here. We reached here because what was gender politics? Gender politics started, say, 50 years ago. That was more feminist politics, right? From feminist, it evolved, it went into the areas of LGBTQ, then that category increased, right? Sexual choices, and then it came to gender choices. I would say that started about 15, 20 years back, and then it grew in the liberal constituency, and it became a liberal issue as much as LGBTQ. Now, as it became more a liberal issue, it was still sort of on the sidelines of the larger debate. It did not become such a big issue. It started becoming a big issue because of sport, and several things happened. The most recent was Paris Olympics. The Algerian boxer, you saw her pictures. She won the gold medal in her category and quite easily. And it was said that she was a man boxing as a woman. Now remember, Iman Khalif, the Algerian boxer, is not a transgender. She has declared herself to be a woman from birth. She was certified born as a woman. She is in a completely different category. That is called DSD. DSD is differential sexual development. We also have a case of DSD athlete in our country, and a noted medal-winning athlete, that is Duty Chand. Now, DSD athletes, many of the associations allow them to compete in their sports provided they keep their testosterone levels under a certain limit. So they also take medications to suppress their testosterone, and these associations have believed that if testosterone is kept within those limits, then they can compete with women. It does not give them any special advantage given the fact that they started out having more testosterone or more male characteristic. So she is not transgender. In fact, when she went back with her medal in Algeria, where you're not allowed to be LGBTQ, Algeria is a very conservative society. In fact, punishments are quite harsh. However, that became a big issue because International Boxing Association had certified her as not qualified to participate in the women's category because they said that they had failed the tests that they conducted on her, basically hormone tests, and her hormones were out of the range and she could not have competed there. However, Paris Olympics de-recognized the International Boxing Association, which also became a political issue because IBA was controlled by the Russians. So it was seen as the Russians are doing this, they are playing games, and IBA itself is corrupt, their selections are corrupt, their selections of referees and umpires are corrupt, their refereeing is all rotten. So IBA was de-recognized, and accordingly, IBA's ruling on Iman Khalif was not followed. So that became a major issue, and globally it divided the athletic community and it also divided the political community. It became a political cause célèbre for the conservative side. Then what happens? Then there are a couple of incidents in American sport because ultimately the Western world's politics emanates from American debate and American politics. And this is the time when the right in America was staging a comeback. Biden was in power. There's an article by Helen Lewis in the Atlantic magazine of December 30, 2024 issue. That is just a month and a half after Donald Trump's election. That article starts with a volleyball rebellion that took place in America in the summer of 24. This is when a bunch of university volleyball teams refused to participate in matchups against the San Jose University team because it fielded a transgender. So these universities, many of these from conservative states like Nevada, Bowie State, University of Wyoming, Utah State University, they all forfeited their games against San Jose. So that became a big headline story. Then as the campaign started, the Republicans made a big deal of it about men going to women's changing rooms, about men going into women's swimming competitions, about men going into women's locker areas, about men identifying as women, participating in women's sports. And they got the picture of this 6'6" person. I'm carefully saying person, Gabrielle Ludwig. Gabrielle, the female spelling, E-double-L-E. Gabrielle Ludwig, who came back to college at the age of 50 plus, in her 50s. Now asserting herself to be a woman and towering over everybody else, she had transitioned to being a female. Now, this picture of this Gabrielle Ludwig towering over everybody else was used by the Republicans in their campaign, saying this is what the Democrats stand for. Democrats started out being very politically correct on this. All American presidents signed their executive orders early on as they took over. One of Biden's earliest executive orders on his first day in office said all children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to restrooms, to locker rooms, or to school sport. What does it mean? That means that all school children, when they go to school, don't force them to believe whether they are male or female. They can make their choice as they go ahead. So once again, the argument is the same. Is gender a biological given, or is it a social construct? Biden, as his term began, weighed in on the side of this being a social construct. But as the Republicans built pressure on this, Democrats started shifting their positions. However, they could never answer something like this poster, this Gabrielle Ludwig, 6'6" in her 50s, coming back after transition saying, I'm a woman. And everybody then said on the Republican side, see, how will the women contest against her? So this whole business of gender being a social construct and people being able to transition from one gender to the other, etc., is anti-woman. And it's obvious that Republican Party benefited from this. And one of Donald Trump's first orders also after getting elected was to say that America recognizes only two sexes, that is male or female. Now, Democrats started shifting their position. They tried to nuance it, but it never worked because they had started out with a full-fledged support for trans inclusion. This, however, became, the Atlantic article says, an unanswerable liability. For the left, for the liberal left in America and in the Western world, this was seen to be a logical next step from equality for blacks, other racial equality, for legalization of same-sex marriage. It was generally believed that this was only the next step in evolution. However, this became an issue between what is seen as two traditionally marginalized groups, women athletes or gender non-conforming people, which would mostly mean those who were either born male or transgender and chose to become female. You can call them transgenders, but gender non-conforming people who might choose something else to be their gender than what they were born in. So this became a question of genes or genetics versus experience of gender. The first transgender to contest in women's sport became the mirror of this debate. The first transgender to participate in an Olympic Games was at Tokyo in 2021. This was a weightlifter, Laurel Hubbard, who participated. The mood, however, in America also has been changing because as this became more of a political issue, many of the Democratic supporters also changed their minds. So see the polling results. In 2021, when Biden signed his orders after his inauguration, 55% Democrats were for gender fluidity. By 2023, that number had already come to 55% to 47% among Democratic voters and supporters. Overall in America, the support for gender fluidity was 3 out of 10. That means 7 out of 10 believed that sex was determined by what you were born as. And specific events happened which hardened the argument and debate and polarization leading up to the US elections. One of those issues was the Elon Musk factor. One of his children, one of his 14, decided to transition to female gender. And he was so distraught by this, he saw it as such a personal affront that he launched a whole campaign against this gender wokeism or gender fluidity. That also pushed him so fully, lock, stock, and barrel, and billions into the Donald Trump camp. Now, this continued to play out in the field of sport. For example, this came up in the recent election of the president of the International Olympic Committee. Their gender became an issue, and 5 of the 7 candidates said that they wanted gender clarity, that they will not allow anybody transgender to play in women's sport. 5 out of 7. And even the woman who finally got elected as the IOC chief, that is Christy Coventry, Zimbabwean minister, she said that she stands for a blanket ban on transgenders or people with unclear gender in women's sport. That is where sport stands now. In fact, of the 7 candidates was also Sebastian Coe, the former middle distance runner and twice Olympic gold winner, who had also said something similar. In fact, in the campaign, he said the protection of the female category is absolutely non-negotiable. You can choose names, pronouns, lifestyles. In some cases, biology really matters. And that is the line that came out of 5 out of 7 candidates, one of whom has got elected now. You may ask me a very legitimate question, a very genuine question, that what's the big deal if somebody who might have some male characteristics or who might not fully come up to the definition of being a woman, or what are the consequences? What's the big problem with being relaxed on this question, on sports being allowed to follow gender fluidity? So we have to understand that women's sport is different from men's sport. To make it very simple for you, track and field, athletics. It's not just that the timings and distances are different, because there is a biological difference there which reflects in sporting performance. This is not to say one is stronger, one is weaker. That's the fact. That's why hurdles are lower for women than for men. The weight and the size of the javelin, hammer, and the shot put, all of that is lower for the women's events. Even in cricket, boundaries are shorter, but boundaries are flexible in cricket these days. But the size of the cricket ball has less circumference of about half a centimeter to 1 centimeter for women's cricket, and weight which is less for women's cricket by about 5 to 10 grams. That is to suit the biodynamics of a woman's body. These are simple facts of science and biology. And that's why the questions over transgenders or those in transition, those who've transitioned to being female, playing in women's sport become so polarizing. Now, Trump has already issued another executive order on February 5, banning transgenders from any women's sports. In fact, the state of Maine, which is a liberal state, has persisted with this. So the federal government has decided to sue the state of Maine as well. I will also share with you an article by Michael Shear in the New York Times, which says that legal assault on trans rights is now taking place from both sides of the Atlantic. Hungary, in fact, going with the flow, because Viktor Orban is in many ways is the leader of the pack. He has put a ban on all public events, public displays by the LGBT community. And why go that far? Even look at our own country. In Amritsar, the Pride March was blocked by the SGPC because they said this goes against Sikh values. So globally, in democracies, there is a rise of conservatism, which is now locking horns with gender politics. Trump again is leading this. Again, hear from him, and I quote from him, that there should be a ban on any child being told that they are trapped in the wrong body. And he says again, and I quote, "Our message to every child in America is that you all are perfect exactly the way God made you. Wokeness is trouble. Wokeness is bad." So politics of the right now is a war on wokeness, and gender politics is very much, particularly gender fluidity politics, is very much a part of that wokeness as it's defined by its adversaries now, and the adversaries are winning. And Trump says that we've already banished it from our schools and from our military, and it should go from elsewhere also. Beatrix von Storch, leader of AfD, the right-wing hard-right AfD in Germany has been saying it. Meloni, Putin, Viktor Orban, usual suspects. After the UK Supreme Court judgment, Nigel Farage said the lunacy is over. This should lead to an outbreak of common sense. Donald Trump at the same time has also instructed Marco Rubio to lean on the International Olympic Committee to ensure that the gender purity of the women's events is maintained. And remember, the next Olympics are going to take place in Los Angeles. Many of the sporting associations have already put strict bans on transgenders or those transitioning playing in the women's events. Big medal-heavy sports, swimming, track and field, cycling, and so on. And now we come to the opinion segment, which I told you occasionally we'll do in Cut the Clutter. A lot of the left-right politics in the world used to be about economic issues in the past. It still is. Some of it also used to be about racial equality. It was also about gender issues. However, in the course of time, politics on both sides, left and the right, became more extreme and sharper. As the left politics became sharper, on the right there was religion and there was nationalism. Both are very difficult to fight. On the left, gender, there was race, and then there was gender. Gender, as long as it was about women's rights, it was one thing. Then LGBT, okay, that was an important issue, but again, that's a very small community. So the vote power of that community is very tiny, it's infinitesimal. And then as it evolved into the era of wokeness, that's when gender fluidity came in. If LGBT are such a small community in terms of a vote bank, gender fluidity supporters are an even smaller number. Now, however virtuous this cause may have looked to the liberal side, this became an albatross around their necks. And then the other side, that is Meloni, Orban, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump most prominently, they then used this albatross to strangle the liberal side by saying, if you elect these people, do you really want to give power back to people who will not even let you parents know what your child's gender is, and that your child in the school will be told that gender is not something that you got as you were born. You can choose your gender as you go along. There are facilities, there are surgeries, there are hormonal drugs. You just have to start early. And you know what? Medical science is getting better and better and better. And this is now becoming a big business in the Western medical world. Gender affirmation or gender transition treatments and surgeries. Do you really want it? What happens in these cases is that intellectual arguments remain in one place. But ultimately, in politics, in democracy, it's the power of the vote that matters. So if a certain number of young people, the same people broadly who hold demonstrations or angry protests over Gaza, for example, the same people who held protests over Black Lives Matter, the same people then embrace the idea of gender fluidity. Now that is a very small group of people. They are young people, but remember, for every young person, there are two parents, there might be two more grandparents. So this becomes also a generational conflict. In the process, a lot of people who were sitting in the center, and particularly people of a slightly older generation, let's say the parents and the grandparents' generation, they shifted right because they just could not put up with this kind of wokeness. And that has led to the results that we have seen. That has at least contributed greatly to the results that we have seen in many of the Western liberal democracies, where liberalism is now fighting a losing battle. And one of the reasons it's fighting a losing battle is picking up these cases which look important, which must have their virtues, but politics is not an argument in a seminar or not in a debate in an academic journal. Politics is about what argument will get more voters on your side. And that is where we've seen in the US, Democrats have been pulling away from this gender fluidity support, and others also are doing it in other Western democracies. Now the liberal argument could be that these are also human beings. They can be transgenders. These are people who are born as male or female but feel like the other gender. So a gender one gender trapped in the body, biological body of another. So they should have a choice. They should also have rights. Good point. Everybody must have rights. But this is a very small community. Now, I'm afraid of using the expression marginal because marginalized in political debate means something else. And the argument, counter argument would then be, do you want a politics where we leave marginalized groups or communities aside or dump them because it is not useful to us electorally? The liberal side can ask that question. The answer is that politics, democratic politics, electoral politics is about the mainstream. You have to get enough votes from the mainstream. If you can get enough votes from the mainstream, then you can use those votes also to serve your agenda for the marginal groups. But if you get your politics to be completely trapped in the issues, in the polarizing issues of marginal groups, then you lose the mainstream. That is precisely what has happened with the global, particularly Western liberal left. I would say the entire liberal community, but particularly the liberal left. So this UK Supreme Court judgment, what it does is, it actually gives you legal evidence, a moral argument, because it's the Supreme Court of the UK, and it also underlines the distinction between the mainstream view, the large, wide and deep mainstream view, and the argument, hard argument on the woke liberal side, which has become marginalized, particularly in electoral terms in the course of time. That's the reason liberal parties and liberal communities, particularly in democracies, have to now make a course correction. They are making some of it, but this will require a much stronger course correction if they have to again regain the center, because the only way they can defeat the hard right is if they reclaim the center. Because the hard left today, particularly in Western democracies, will always be smaller than hard right, because hard right also has nationalism and religion. This, as I promised you, was the short opinion segment. If you like this, we'll do this more often in Cut the Clutter, but I will clearly identify this as an opinion segment.